So my name is Molly Sweeney. I'm going to probably be presenting for about 45 minutes. And then we've got a little bit of time at the end just to maybe talk about the kind of challenges of volunteering, if anyone's got any challenges that they have, or any kind of recruitment challenges in particular around designing volunteer roles or recruiting for volunteers, they can kind of raise that. Sorry, I'm just looking to see if there's a clock in my room. There is not. So I might have to pause and check the time. So I hope people won't mind this rough and ready approach. There we are. Fab. So yeah, I'm Molly Sweeney. I'm currently the volunteering project manager, but I am transitioning to another role, the community program manager for East London for Groundwork London. Groundwork London, if you've not encountered us before, is a community and environmental charity, which is also part of a national federation of different charities that do sort of lots of different work around all aspects of the environment, bringing people together. And the work that I've been doing is running a volunteer centre called the Legends of the Forest programme in Waltham Forest, which is in northeast London. And a large part of my role was supporting organisations big and small with kind of best practice in volunteer management and managing the recruitment process and all of those different aspects around volunteering. So I've got a lot of experience supporting people who are interested in volunteering, supporting people who are interested in volunteering, but also in supporting organisations with recruiting volunteers. And the Legend service is going in-house. So this is the last week of my Legend, so I can be very honest about the challenges, as well. It's obviously a wonderful borough, but a lot of challenges obviously we're all facing. So what I was wondering we could do just now at the beginning to get a sense of the temperature in the room is in the chat, it can be one of these numbers or it can be many of these numbers to reflect the sort of pictures of how you feel. And I'll just about kind of recruiting and retaining volunteers at the beginning of this decade, still technically at the beginning, the 2020s. So I'll run through the pictures. So the first picture is someone looking serene with a background of flowers. That's number one. Number two is someone looking very confident in a sharp suit. Number three is someone who's lost in a forest. Number four is someone who's jumping for joy, looking out to the sea. And number five is someone with a really big stack of books that they're struggling to carry. So if in the chat you can put which numbers reflect how you feel at the moment. And just see, so in the chat, we've got so number three, which is that someone looking lost. Number four, a lot of excitement and positivity, some threes. Yeah, so a lot of people feeling really overwhelmed. Yeah, but a lot of people also feeling very excited about the kind of enthusiastic about the future. Super. So that sort of gets a sense of the picture in the room. A lot of people are kind of excited at the opportunity, but also kind of overwhelmed and feeling a bit lost and confused. I didn't see many people feeling incredibly calm and serene or incredibly confident. And part of the reason for that is this very scary slide where I've listed all of the things that are wrong in the world. So that's things like COVID, obviously that recovery, and then the cost of living crisis, staffing issues, mental health crisis, school attendance, NHS waiting lists, the climate crisis, increasing extreme weather. Think about the heat waves, and you must have, if you don't have an air-conditioned office, it must have impacted your productivity and may have had really, challenging impacts on people who have got difficult, complex lives or health issues. Air pollution, I'm speaking from London, there's a lot of air pollution and the impact of that. Political polarisation, obviously the challenges overseas and the sort of terrible impact of the war in Ukraine, in Sudan, Afghanistan. Interest rates in the economy, and then everyone is exhausted. So obviously those aren't all of the issues we're facing, but I was kind of just thinking, oh, what are some issues people are facing? And it was very easy to type out just the ones on top of my head, the ones I've been reading about that day. And those have a big impact on all sorts of voluntary organisations and organisations that involve volunteers. And it may be that your work isn't really directly about people who experience mental ill health, but perhaps a colleague is, got a family member with a mental health issue and they're really struggling to get treatment for that. Perhaps you yourself are finding the mental toll really difficult, of kind of living from, for the last sort of 3 and a bit years, really, living in a time that feels like there's endless crises, and then all the other challenges we're kind of facing in our own personal lives. So kind of whatever, you might have an organization that's really working directly with all of these issues, or it might be an organization that's removed from these directly issues, but it is impacting everyone. I think it's really helpful to acknowledge that we're living in a really challenging time, and that means every issue that you face becomes more complicated and more difficult. That's the picture for everything. And then the picture for volunteering. So I think there's a clearly identified need for innovation in volunteering. There's a lot of issues. So I've just got some stats on the screen there. But basically, volunteer recruitment is down. The number of people volunteering, the number of people who are satisfied is down. Younger volunteers are less satisfied than older volunteers, and obviously younger volunteers are volunteers we want to sort of keep. Not to devalue at all older volunteers, but there's a challenge in recruiting younger volunteers. Volunteer burnout is increasingly an issue. So, 26% of volunteers saying it's too much like paid work. And as part of my work supporting organisations, I've definitely heard that people are finding it much harder to recruit and retain volunteers. It feels like a real challenge to keep hold of people and to recruit, and that people just have less capacity, less time. They might have returned to work because of the cost of living crisis. They might be suffering from health issues. And obviously we're still recovering from people pausing volunteering during the pandemic and then not returning. Whereas the people that were able to step up during the pandemic because of things like furlough are not able to anymore, obviously. Another kind of example for the need for innovation in volunteering is what I like to call the Miss Marple problem, keeping with the 20s theme. So basically, Miss Marple from the Agatha Christie books is a volunteer police detective, which is a job substitution. So I'm not sure I would probably question how involved she is in professional paid work, but she started doing this in her 50s because she didn't work. She was, that was the expected thing at the time, as women kind of who are middle class didn't work. Obviously working class women have always worked, but that's that kind of historical thing. And if we think about kind of the last 20 years, obviously there's been a lot of demographic changes, so women working more, and obviously that's been the case throughout the last sort of 50 years, but that kind of, it is more common for women to work and work full time, and then to work up until their 60s and sort of later on. And that kind of demographic change has impacted volunteering. Now, that's not to say all volunteers are women and not recognise the contribution of male volunteers, which is really important. But there were people who it was, that not expected that they would have a paid job, and therefore they were able to be that reliable person who would stick to one volunteering role. Nowadays, if you're someone who's done, had a really busy career with a lot of different elements, you may not want to just take on one volunteer role. I found with charity shops, that's a real issue. Often when I would speak to people who are, especially women who just recently retired and were looking for a volunteering role, they would often say, anything but charity shops. Don't want to do charity shops. And that was something that I kind of heard reflected when speaking to organisations, to charity shop managers or people in charge of recruitment for big sort of charities, saying, we have a real issue in charity shops because we have a lot of young people who want to volunteer, a lot of people who really need support with volunteering, and that's wonderful, and we really appreciate that, and some of those people are great sort of volunteers. But what we really need is someone super reliable who's got lots of experience, who's really just will sort of sort everything out, and he's able to kind of take some of that pressure off the manager. And they would kind of have this picture in their mind of a Miss Marple type. And the reality is that that sort of person doesn't necessarily exist anymore. Women in their 50s and 60s are more likely to be doing things like, looking after grandchildren if they're not working, or working and juggling those things. So my mum is in her 60s and she's going to be working till she's 68. And then on her day where she doesn't work during the week, she looks after my niece. So I hope people don't think that this is me saying only women volunteer, but I think it kind of has to be acknowledged that those demographic changes, which, you know, I benefited from, women in the workplace, it does have an impact on volunteering. And so those kind of traditional models do have to kind of change. And then, so I don't know if people are familiar with the vision for volunteering. So the vision for volunteering is a really exciting program. It's a movement to create a diverse, innovative, ambitious, equitable and person-centered future for volunteering. So this is kind of the solution to these big problems. And I don't know if people have been to any of their amazing seminars. There's so many brilliant ideas. It's really exciting. Feels like a really great kind of future. But there is an issue, which is the capacity of organizations and what organizations need. So there's a sort of vicious circle that volunteers, you know, organizations don't have enough volunteers. They maybe struggle to deliver services. And because of those problems we previously identified, they may be finding that, you know, they have to deliver more services. They may have to deliver a warm space, and they may have had some funding for that, but not full cost recovery, not, you know, funding that covers all of those aspects. They may be kind of taking on more, if they run a sort of counselling service for people with mild mental health issues, they may be finding that they're taking on more of that. If they run a gardening project, they may find that they have to spend a lot of time chasing up referrals because everyone's overstretched. So they want to innovate volunteering. They don't have any capacity, time, expertise, money to innovate because they're too busy doing all these things, and they've had to cut this post to save money. So the offer remains the same, so they don't have enough volunteers. And I've also written that to-do list, which may be familiar, that you've got to apply for a grant, email your contract manager, do all these different things. Oh, and then, you know, between 4:30 and 5, innovate your entire volunteering offer. And that's, you know, obviously even more challenging when it's a volunteer-led organisation. We just aren't in the position maybe to kind of massively change everything about what we're delivering, when we also have to focus on what the service users need. So I think these are amazing conversations around innovation, have to acknowledge these challenges. So I have thought about this, and I was like, oh, what's the solution? And I was like, I don't really know. However, I kind of thought about 3 different models. And rather than saying, well, this is the one weird trick to solve your volunteer recruitment problems, here are 3 different ways you might approach it, depending on what your organization needs, what's useful, you know, where this would work, maybe where this is challenging, where it wouldn't work, and then taking some time at the end to think about other things. But so I've got these kind of 3 models, which I'll just run through. So the first one is the hero volunteer. So 40% of people, according to the Time Well Spent report, the survey from the NCDO, is they wanted to improve things and help people. And that's their main thing. They wanted to do that. So they're, you know, we often think about other motivations, but it's important to remember, I want to be the person making that difference. And I think that's one of the things I always say to people when they're planning kind of their recruitment campaign is, how are you telling someone that they're the person making the difference? So what this could look like. So the first example, what do you wish you knew when you first became a dad, is really tying into that lived experience and how you as that individual with that experience can make that difference. When something's around a particular expertise, are you the coding expert who can help us support more homeless people? Are you that person? Obviously, think again, you know, advocacy, lived experience, you're sharing your experience with the people making key decisions. And then also around that personal connection, the thing you're bringing, you're the person putting the smile on their face. You'll be able to leave, you know, your kind of volunteering session feeling like you made a big difference. And then, are you tough enough? Again, like, this isn't just for anyone. This is for people who have an extra level of commitment. So I think roles that are kind of challenging. I think whenever a role's challenging or difficult or just requires kind of standing around in the cold, the most important thing is you don't underplay that it is challenging, but you seek out those people who want something that's a bit harder, who want something that involves, you know, it's not just, you know, having a nice chat and a cup of tea in a warm room and then going home. It's doing something that will take it out of you, but you'll know that you've made a massive difference. And I think this is particularly valuable for roles where there's a longer term commitment which is required, and where, you know, you're really going to have to rely on the volunteer bringing their own motivation. So it's really tapping into, I suppose, that ego, which we all have, and that desire to make a difference and think of ourselves as a person that makes the difference. Obviously, there are challenges around this and where this maybe wouldn't work so well. So one of which is around equality and diversity. From the point of view of a volunteer, it may be that, depending on the nature of the role, the people that receive support from the organisation and the people that volunteer may be very different. And it may be that that's something that you're kind of working toward overcoming, but it may be the case, for example, if there are people who have real challenges, where people who've got some profound mental health challenges or profound disabilities, and it's unlikely that those people are going to be able to take on the same volunteering roles that the volunteers do. We kind of want to avoid narratives of you'll be a savior, you'll save these people. I think, we all remember those adverts about children in kind of sub-Saharan Africa walking for water, and the way that those kind of images nowadays, we wouldn't necessarily see it in the same way, because it's a bit patronizing and kind of reduces the humanity of that person. And I remember seeing an advert quite recently that instead presented this child instead of presenting this child as an object of pity, they presented this child, oh sorry, 1 second, oh that's fine, presenting an object of pity, representing this child as a future politician, CEO. She could achieve so many different things if only we can help her and we can support her to achieve her goals, rather than, oh, look at this poor child. So that's something we want to avoid. Also around things like lived experience, it may be that people who kind of receive services don't want to be giving their time for free when the professionals who don't have those lived experiences are being paid. I think that could be a really challenging area for things like mental health, where people are always being asked to come in and give talks about the different, their experience, which can be quite a painful thing for them as well. So I think that's something to bear in mind, that importance of reflecting, sorry, some background noise, importance of reflecting on what you're asking for people with lived experience, and where it's appropriate to start paying people and consider that to be a paid role. I think that's an area that care needs to be taken in. And also, to be blunt, roles where it's quite boring and where no one is ever going to think that they're the only person that's going to be the person that makes a difference. If you need someone to help with leafleting or, doing admin, it may be that people are going to find it a bit silly if you're like, you are a hero. And there's another way of approaching that. So it's sort of important to think about the nature of the role and the difference that it's the way that that's going to come across to a volunteer, and how you don't want to overplay that. But that's one approach. The other approach is just thinking, and in a way it's kind of different, is task-based, which is very much, what tasks do you need doing that volunteers can take off your list? And I think that was a big part of the appeal of volunteering sometimes, is that people might just jump out, in their lunch break when they're working from home, get in the car, pick something up, drop it off. They might just ring someone once a week. Instead of being super like, oh, you'll be a hero, it's, if you could just do this one thing, it would be really helpful. And it fits in with people's sense of just doing a quick thing to help someone else rather than being a volunteer, because obviously the identity of a volunteer is not a universal one. It's not one everyone is super comfortable with. People don't always, in the sort of opposite to the kind of previous way of approaching things, they don't always want to feel like, oh, I'm being a special different person. They're just doing something to help someone out, and that's just the way that they do. And especially in some communities which have a really strong kind of ties and everyone helps everyone out, that's not, they don't really see it in that way. I went to speak at a sixth form in Leytonstone to some computer science students, and I said to them, who here has volunteered? And of course there was absolute silence, in the way that there often is when you ask a question in a school. So I said, has anyone ever helped out at their church or their mosque, the temple? And one of the students said, oh yeah, well, during lockdown I set up like a Zoom thing, and I helped all the sort of older congregation to get onto the streaming platforms, and all of these things that he'd done. But of course he didn't see them as volunteering. It was just part of being a part of that community. So what this could look like, On your way home, pick up some shopping for an elderly neighbour, just drop it off. Nip into the school and read with year 3. Maybe that's just part of your day. Take a brain break at work by doing 15 minutes of citizen science. Write a letter to a lonely older person. We need someone around for 2 hours to work out how to better organise this data. So this is super like, this is just a quick thing we want you to do and it will make a big difference. So I think it could be really valuable. And then in terms of where this may be a challenge or maybe this maybe wouldn't work, is roles where relationships are really important. You know, where you do need that longer term commitment and that sense of, you know, this is the relationship is the key thing. Obviously, security and safeguarding are really important, and where you want to keep things super task-based and super quick and efficient, you may be the kind of know what we need to do, you know, reference checks and DBS checks and all those aspects and GDPR and everything training that may kind of come in the way of the super quick task-based side of things. When the faff factor, as I put it, when there are annoying or faffy bits, people maybe don't have that buy-in. If it's just nipping in and doing something super quickly, but then they've got to do GDPR training, they've got to go and do this and that and the other first, they might go, oh, I just thought it would be really quick and I can't really be bothered with all that extra stuff. And there you need that extra buy-in of the kind of hero volunteer model. Where volunteers want social contact, or where that's an important reason for them volunteering, which is obviously a big reason that people volunteer. If you've got a role, you know, where their main reason is to connect, meet new people, you've moved to a new place, you want to make new friends, and it's like, come in, pick that up, go home, bye. That works for some people because that fits in with their lifestyle, but it maybe doesn't work for others. And I imagine it's quite a kind of vulnerable thing. You may not want to ask to say, oh, but I wouldn't mind having a bit of a chat, but that is a really important part of involving volunteers. And where regular commitment is essential. So we're being reliant on volunteers for delivery of services at a particular time, a particular place, a volunteer counsellor, you know, a guide leader, as opposed to someone who might drop into the guide group and do an activity, but you know, someone who's kind of got that need for that commitment. So the last one of these kind of approaches is part of a team. So I suppose this again is a bit different to the last one, which is all about dropping in, running, you know, picking up some shopping, dropping it off, however, whatever. This is being that really pulling on that sense of being part of a team. So pretty much everyone I know, not that that's a, you know, scientific sample, but everyone I know has reported feeling more isolated and less connected since the pandemic. And a desire to make friends and build connections is obviously a big reason that people volunteer, as I've mentioned. And so this is, instead of like, you're going to be the person that's going to make the difference, or oh, it's no bother, it's 15 minutes out of your week. This is about bringing people kind of together and really playing up that sense. So that might be, you know, join our amazing food pantry. We're changing how we tackle food poverty. You'll be part of something new, but you'll be part of this team. We're the largest mobilisation of young people for climate in this country. So you'll be part of a really big movement. You know, hey, this is all about making friends and meeting new people. It's not about being an expert, or, you know, you'll learn from others, and making it clear that it's about making new friends. Again, emphasising socials and the WhatsApp groups and being part of that. Sometimes WhatsApp groups can get out of control, but again, that sense of, you know, this is, you know, something where you're going to be part of something that feels kind of warm and nice, and you can share jokes and see people's pet pictures. And maybe if you don't have that kind of social connection, this is a way of gaining that. And even if it's online, maybe it's a remote opportunity, but you kind of create a space for online connection. And where this can work, obviously not all roles suit this, where they're not part of a team. So maybe you just need one volunteer. And it's important not to kind of assume that, you know, oh, well, obviously we'll all make friends with this volunteer. You kind of got to be aware of that if you just have one volunteer in your staff, there might be that barrier. In sort of smaller organizations where, you know, it's one or two people, you've also got to be aware of things like cliques. You know, it might be that some people become part of a team, but then if you're not part of that team, you feel really isolated. So you have to work on creating that the right environment. Also, where there are time pressures and you don't have that 15 minutes at the beginning of the day to build in, to create social connection, where if considering the kind of demographics of the people, there are people who will just never go to a social because they don't have that extra time to give up to something social. Maybe their childcare pressures, maybe it's a role where everyone kind of has quite busy lives with work and other things. And so if you joined that opportunity looking for a more social side, you just wouldn't get it. It's also something that's likely to develop organically, and I think there are things you can do as a volunteer coordinator to increase the likelihood of that, but I also don't think you can force it to happen, and I think that that's an area where it's a challenge. So those are those approaches that kind of ran through, and hopefully some of those might kind of chime with some of your experiences or kind of where you want to be with recruiting volunteers. So the key, I've written here, the key sentence for recruiting volunteers. And this is maybe a little bit my one-way trick, but I think this is something that people have found helpful. And I kind of wanted to bring something rather than like a lot of questions, one thing that might be a useful thing to bring into your practice as a volunteer coordinator or thinking about volunteer recruitment. So in the Time Well Spent report, they've commented that while significant external events have events is quite a funny understatement. I think, while significant external events have affected many aspects of volunteering, the core motivation of wanting to improve things, help people, has not changed between 2019 and 2023. So that is that reason, that altruistic, compassionate reason. So when you're thinking about what you're saying to a volunteer, it's what's the difference the role will make. If you give your time, volunteer with us, come along to our sessions, whatever it may be, you will help a child gain a year's progress in reading in 2 months, welcome refugees and help them feel part of the community, combat the climate emergency, stop food being wasted by giving it to hungry people, help your community get heat wave ready. I was doing a lot of climate work when I was talking about this, so I think that's why there's quite a few climate references here. So I think this is a really important thing, is sum up the difference the role will make in one sentence. And that's something you're telling people. So often when we're talking about volunteering, we might talk about the activities you're going to do. We might talk about the administrative things about when you need to turn up, what you need to wear, all those kind of things, the DBS check. Or you might talk about the charity as a whole and the difference you're making as a charity. Or you might talk about what you need from the volunteer, the skills the volunteer needs. And those are all the really important things to include in that role description, the advert on Team Kinetic, super important. But this is the most important question. If you give your time, X will happen. You will do X. And that I think is super important as a kind of sentence to always include whenever you're recruiting a volunteer, and almost to start from that position. What is our one sentence where a volunteer will read that and go, yes, I'm going to volunteer for that role because that I want to make a difference with my time, and that's the difference I will make. That's something that's super important to keep in mind. The next point I suppose I have is around like policy, and I don't know, if there's anyone kind of with an ear to Rishi Sunak in the room, maybe not. But I think it's important not just to think about this as a challenge on an individual level, but when you're speaking with anyone who ever asks you, oh, we really want to hear what the voluntary sector has to say. Here are some things I think that are really important from a policy level. And I feel like the voluntary sector does a lot of stuff. We do an amazing amount of work to help people and help our communities. And we plug a lot of gaps. And we're really reliant on the voluntary sector for a whole range of things. And therefore, we need to start saying we need more respect. I think volunteer management is not necessarily respected as a skill as much as I think it ought to be. Sometimes in job adverts, you'll notice that volunteer management, head of volunteering, the kind of volunteer manager position is paid less than the head of fundraising or head of development, even though maybe they're actually the same job if you look at the detail. We could also talk about the demographics of who works in volunteering and whether or not they're more likely to be men or women, not to get too feminist about it, but that kind of sense of that respect for the expertise of managing volunteers, and why maybe that's not valued as much as it ought to be when it's in fact incredibly challenging. Whenever I've kind of had sessions with people who have at the beginning of involving volunteers in their projects, then towards the end, they'll almost always say, oh, it's a lot harder than I was expecting. It's a lot more complicated, because it's not just administrative, and it's not just interpersonal, and it's not just strategic, and it's not just about kind of really thinking about those complex issues of how do we involve someone in a way, but then thinking about the impact on service users and balancing all those different needs and requirements, but also making sure that everyone has, you know, a laptop. It's a really complicated area of work. I think it's much harder. Managing volunteers is much harder than managing staff, because you can't say to a volunteer, do this or you won't have a job. So you're kind of always kind of in a bit of a bind. So I think just having that respect for the expertise is really important, and obviously that's part of things like conferences like this. The other thing is a really practical thing: funding for volunteer expenses. I think that makes a big difference for organisations. It's something a lot of organisations have mentioned. It would take a massive kind of slice of money out of, you know, off people's hands, and you can have a fund. My dream is a fund that, you know, anyone could just apply for their charity. You just say, this is our charity, you know, here's our financial, the proof that we're respectable, not messing around with the money. And then we just get the expenses, and that means all sorts of people can volunteer. And it also means that, you know, organisations don't have to worry about that funding. And if we're so reliant on the voluntary sector, it feels like a really useful thing. And then obviously, and this is probably quite difficult, but more capacity in the system, more, you know, not everyone having to work 100% all the time, which means they don't have that time to do this sort of innovative thinking that things like the Vision for Volunteering are talking about. So I feel like those are the kind of things we need to ask for. I think one of those asks, funding for volunteer expenses, is maybe an easier ask than just less pressure. But I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that policy picture. So that's my kind of bit of the presentation, which I hope was sort of helpful and useful in terms of talking about volunteering. So, there are some comments. So Joanna has said, many of our sector's heritage sector existing volunteer roles are geared towards traditional volunteers, cisgendered, disposable income, white, retirement age, educated, etc. Is refreshing how we approach sharing our volunteering opportunities enough? Or is it really that we need to completely rethink the volunteer opportunity offer and engage with people from communities who are underrepresented in our volunteer programs and find out from them what a volunteer experience should be? I mean, Joanna, you've literally very handily created what I'm about to talk about. So that's a brilliant bridge. Thank you very much. I definitely think that that's something really valuable. Like if I would also like tap into the Vision for Volunteering discussions, because there are loads of discussions about what people want from volunteering. I think it is really a good thing to go back to basics and think, especially if you're struggling with that recruitment, what do people want out of volunteering? What feels like a good volunteering opportunity? What feels like enough of a commitment or too much? And that's not obviously to suggest that, you know, the traditional volunteers aren't valuable at all, or that we shouldn't consider what they want at all. But I think kind of sometimes it's really good to go back to the drawing board. Again, a challenge when you're super reliant on things, but maybe trying out different approaches as well. So that's one volunteering con do. What I was wondering if maybe we could do either in the chat, or I've also got a Jamboard, if people have ever used those before, is basically sharing your volunteering quandaries. Is there an area of your work in volunteer management that feels like a challenge, essentially? If you want to sort of share that in the Jamboard, and then maybe we can kind of see if we can, in the next 10 minutes, see if we can give any sort of see if we can kind of crowdsource some support. So if you're like, oh, we're really struggling to recruit for this role, or we've got this problem. So, oh great, there's some people joined. So you go to the Jamboard, and then I've put a little picture here as well. You want to click this post-it note where it's a sticky note, and then you type it in. Oh, nearly knocked over my water. It's fine. So you might say, struggling to recruit trustees, for example. And this is anonymous if you like, and then you just put it here. So does that make sense to everyone? If you're struggling, feel free to just write it in the chat or say it out loud and I'll type it up. But it'd be good to have like some post-it notes with volunteering quandaries for the next. So we'll just take a couple of minutes to do that, and I will stop talking for 2 minutes before my voice is a problem. It goes completely. So I'll just. Okay, am I still sharing? Yes, hopefully. So we've got like a lot of really amazing quandaries here. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but maybe what we'll do is pick one and we'll sort of go through them. I'll just try and randomly pick one. Okay, I'm going to go for how to create a sense of community among volunteers who lone work, so people who volunteer on their own. Does anyone feel free to like shout out? Does anyone think, oh, I've got a kind of solution to that, or any ideas? So feel free to shout out or put in the chat. So this one, in terms of how to create a community among volunteers who lone work, is really challenging. And also, I suppose some people might feel like, oh yeah, so we've got some great points in the chat. So recognition and celebration of volunteers are invited to attend and meet each other. Networking or social events, I think that's really valuable. Obviously, one of the challenges with things like networking and socials is not everyone attends, and people maybe say that they're going to attend, but they don't have that kind of push because they don't know each other super well. So I suppose it's what I would say with things like socials is if, for example, there's mandatory in-person training, always attach a social to that. You need a reason for people to do something. The other thing might be if you're in a kind of specific geographical area, is there a big Christmas fair or kind of other cultural event? Oh, who's going to go to the big bonfire night celebration? Why don't we have a catch up beforehand? I'm saying this because we Waltham Forest, we found that people really liked the idea of socials, but there wasn't that instinct really to turn up. But the ones that were most effective are ones that were tied in with other things. You're connecting with something else. So someone may go, oh, there's an exhibition, I'll go along to that, or there's a big event, and then also do that. WhatsApp groups is a great suggestion. And yeah, bring those sort of little connections. We invite our volunteers to come and base themselves in an office once per week if they want to do so they can mingle with the rest of the team. I think that's really great, and that's an amazing sort of opportunity, especially for people who do want to that increase in social connection. Yeah, I think trips and events, newsletters and blogs written by volunteers is really valuable as well. Those are all great ideas. And I think maybe thinking about things like budget, can you provide, expenses for kind of those volunteer trips and events? Maybe consider perhaps tempo time credits as an option, and you could maybe say, oh, we'll use your tempo time credits and attend this together as well. So that might be a good option. But yeah, I really like the idea of basing themselves in the office as well. I think that's really great. So some good suggestions there. We'll go to another one. I'm going to put this in the chat as well, which is non-attendance, not commitment, is the hardest battle for us. Not getting answers to why people are still signing up but not turning up. Does anyone want to speak on that or got any experience of tackling that? So I'll just kick us off. One thing so I was speaking with an organisation and they had volunteers sign up but then not join the training, which was a barrier. So, which was an issue, obviously. So what we kind of did was mapped out the whole of the volunteer journey. So kind of where they start, all of the aspects, and what the experience is for volunteering, which is obviously a bit of a pain. But do a Jamboard, get post-it notes or whatever, and really map it out. And then what points do volunteers drop off? So it might be that they sign up for the induction day, turn up, but then don't come to the next session. So is there something about the induction day that's off-putting? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it that they do the in-person training but not the online training? And then think about how you can build in that connection and that pull to do something. So one thing that's we found really helpful is phoning people. Not everyone likes phone calls, but phoning people is a really great way of kind of pushing yourself up someone's to-do list. So I think that's a really helpful thing to bear in mind. Push yourself up their to-do list. Give them a deadline for things. So don't say, oh, it'd be great if you could do this and then join it. Give them a really long period of time. Another thing, and this is not something I'm very proud of, but if someone outside of work asks me to download a Word document, fill in the details on the Word document, and then re-upload it and email it, I'm not going to do it. I absolutely have to. So I just found the idea of like that, and then you have to save it, and like, oh, I'll do that later, and then you don't do it. That's not a good thing about me, but are there any things in your process that are annoying, basically? And imagine it from a person like me who's quite lazy, or a person whose IT skills aren't great, or a person who just doesn't check the emails regularly. So think about it from that point of view. And it might be, I think a lot of people in the voluntary sector are really hardworking, committed, passionate people who don't, just push through that kind of irritation and boredom. Imagine being not that person. What would be annoying? So kind of think, what's annoying about this process? If people sign up, oh yeah, no, the Sienna said, yeah, if I'm on the move a lot and if I can do if you can just do it from your phone, that's great. I think one thing I like to think about when I talk about websites as someone who doesn't know anything about the internet or like the complicated technical things is there are websites that look like Facebook, and then there are websites that look like some kind of like your online finance system. And it's one of the things about Team Kinetic when I talk about it actually with providers is I think it's like it feels and looks a bit like Facebook in the sense that it's not, you can do it really quickly. So yeah, think about process is a big one. The other thing is volunteers do drop out, and that can be a good thing because you don't want people, they may not be suitable, it may not be for them. But what might be a good thing is having that information induction session where you don't maybe do the DBS first, you don't do the references, you don't put in all that faff and extra effort for people who aren't going to show up. You get people in, you ask them to bring along their paperwork, and then you sort of get them hooked in and excited. Then you try and get the admin through as quickly as possible and give them an admin to-do list. And then you think, but then all those volunteers who've dropped, who aren't going to do the admin to-do list, who aren't going to come next, you know that they're gone and you don't have to worry about them, and you can give them one final phone call and go, we love meeting you. Sometimes volunteering, people come along and they realize it isn't for them. If not, feel free to get in touch with us anytime. Okay, that person's off our list. And my final point on this as well is give people kind of like, let people know it's fine to drop out. I think it's good to do that. Otherwise you're kind of, you're overwhelmed, your people feel bad and they stay on your list because they don't want to be the person going, oh, I don't actually want to do it anymore because I realized it was too much. So I'm using a mean voice for those people. That's perfectly valid choice. But basically when people are like, actually don't want to do this anymore, it's fine if you don't want to do it anymore. We're not going to call you up and go, why do you hate children? That's not going to happen. I mean, that is, it's an unusual volunteer management approach, but maybe it's what we need, but I wouldn't recommend that. So I've got like 7 minutes left, and I'm chatting too much. What what's the last, what's a really great one that I'm just looking around at what we should pick. So maybe we'll finish with supporting volunteers who have additional, oh, some great comments. Check in with volunteers, maybe there's something going on at home, maybe they, something going on at home, maybe need more support as well. And so the last one that we're going to talk about is supporting volunteers who have additional learning support needs or a disability, ensuring they get a positive experience. So any thoughts or comments, or feel free to put in the chat. So I think with things like this, one thing is to think about looking at the nature of the tasks involved and what, are there tasks that people can choose to take on, and are there kind of main things that will sort of make a difference. So it might be that the full scope of tasks, some people, they're not going to take those tasks on, but they can get involved with other elements. So if you have, for example, a food bank volunteer and there's things that involve maybe interactions with people, you can see if you can remove that element, and so give kind of a pick and mix, a buffet approach to that, the opportunity involved. The other thing is buddy volunteers. And this is something people who are looking to move into support work, who are looking to move into education might well be really interested in. If there's kind of local colleges where people are studying and being a learning support assistant, for example, courses in those teaching assistant courses, this might be something really helpful. Yeah, so support profiles when people declare disabilities and profile, not ideal for those who don't declare. Yeah, definitely that's a challenge. I think one thing that I've learned to do in work outside, so I do theatre outside of my work with groundwork, and in theatre there's often a lot of talk about giving people examples of how you can be support them and be inclusive. So rather than saying just, let us know if you've got any access needs, you can say, we're really happy to do this rather than a video call, have a kind of online chat if you don't like video calls. We're really happy to move this from a noisy kind of room to a quieter room. This space is not wheelchair accessible, but we could find another office. That includes being honest where you can't, things aren't accessible, but letting people know about those changes that can be made. Can be really valuable. So kind of empowering people with the choice, they can choose to do that. The other thing is partnering with groups that support people, and finding out what they kind of think would be important. For example, maybe inviting people who attend a kind of day service, maybe if they've got a learning disability, and doing a focus group with them and finding out what they would think would be helpful, but building those links, because it can be quite daunting going to somewhere on your own, and it may be that people don't always have the skills to advocate for themselves. But if they're part of a group that they know, or they're with people who are kind of experienced in supporting them, they may well feel like, oh, I can actually share what I want to share and want to ask for. I think it's important, and sometimes hard to remember, is advocating for your own needs is a skill that people kind of have to learn or acquire. And I think nowadays we kind of like talk a lot about the important, there's a lot of expectation on people really good at advocating for themselves, and obviously some people are and some people learn to be, but it's kind of like, how do you advocate for yourself or ask for what you need if you've never had that chance to do that, or don't have the skills or tools or the language to do it? So I think one thing that can be valuable is to think, how can someone ask for what they need from us, and how can we make that as easy as possible? Is that having a form? Is that giving examples? Is that saying, today we're going to try it out this way, next week we're going to try it out a different way, you tell me which way is better? And that kind of thing, like how do we support people to say, oh, I prefer it when I don't have to deal with customers, or I like talking to the customers but only for a couple of hours and then I get a bit tired. That side of things. Great, I think that's my time up. I'm certainly talked enough. But yeah, thank you very much for an amazing conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. So I've just jumped on this one. I've just been, I was overseeing a different talk, but the bit I jumped onto was very interesting. Thanks a lot.